the river that gives birth to the gods. The first dawn of history did not arrive with thunder, but with the sound of flowing water. The Nile, the eternal green serpent, winds its way through the desolate desert. On either bank lies red sand, vibrant like dried blood. But where the river touches, life erupts. Reeds sway in the wind, ibis birds take flight, and humanity, small yet resilient, begins to settle, cultivate, and dream of eternity. Before humanity named the gods, before they believed that the soul could live on after death, this world was merely a brutal cycle of survival. The desert stretched endlessly, unforgiving, devoid of memory. There, every trace of life was erased, as if it had never existed. There is no history in the desert, for history requires time, and the desert devours time. And then, the Nile appeared as a paradox. Not violent, not destructive, not imposing. It flows slowly, steadily, quietly, as if it too is contemplating. Each year, neither early nor late, the waters rise, overflow, then recede, leaving behind a layer of soft, warm, black silt. In that moment, life is reborn. Trees sprout where there was once only sand. Humanity learns that if they wait, if they believe in that rhythm, the world will not betray them. That was the first moment the Egyptians stepped out of their primitive state. Not with weapons, but with faith and order. They did not view nature as an enemy to conquer, but as an entity to understand and respect. The sun rising each morning was not a given. It was proof that the world was still functioning correctly. The Nile flooding at the right season was not luck. It was an affirmation that a profound law was being upheld. From that belief, Egyptian thought formed slowly but irrevocably. They believed that if that order were disrupted, not only would crops fail, but the entire world would collapse. And thus, humanity's supreme mission was not to expand, not to conquer, but to maintain that order. They called that order Ma'at. Ma'at has no specific form. It is not a story, but a principle. It exists in the way the sun moves, in the way the Nile flows, in the way humanity must behave towards one another. Lies, betrayal, injustice, all are not merely personal sins, but cracks in the structure of the universe. But a principle cannot defend itself. As communities along the Nile grew larger, as populations increased, as land became property, conflicts arose. Small disputes quickly escalated into wars between regions. And in war, humanity realized that sheer power was not enough. The victor needed a reason to rule, a justification for the vanquished to accept subjugation. Around 3100 BC, a man emerged from the murky depths of history. We call him Narmer. Perhaps that is not his true name. Perhaps it symbolizes many generations of conquerors. But what matters is the idea he carried. Narmer unified Upper and Lower Egypt, not only through force, but through symbolism. He wore 2 crowns. He inscribed his victories on stone. He declared that from now on, this land would no longer be divided, and a new order had been established. From that moment, Egypt was born. But Egypt was not a nation in the conventional sense. It was a sacred entity, and at the center of that entity stood the pharaoh. The pharaoh was not merely a king. He was not chosen by the people, nor did he rule solely through brute force. The pharaoh was the living embodiment of Ma'at. He was the sole bridge between humanity and the divine. Every decision made by the pharaoh affected not only society, but the functioning of the universe. If the pharaoh was strong, just, and upheld the rituals, the sun would continue to rise. The Nile would continue to flood, the world would continue to exist. But if the pharaoh failed, if he acted against Ma'at, then not only would humanity suffer, but the entire cosmic order would collapse. This was a burden no king had borne before. And because this burden could not end with death, the Egyptians arrived at a bold conclusion. The pharaoh must continue to exist after death. From here, the obsession with the afterlife became the center of the entire civilization. The Egyptians did not believe that the soul could exist in a nebulous state. They believed that the soul needed a body, an identity, a memory. If the body decayed, the soul would become lost. If the name was forgotten, the soul would vanish. True death was not when the heart stopped beating, but when no one remembered you. Thus, preparing for death became a sacred duty. Initially, the pharaohs were buried in simple mastaba tombs. But very quickly, those tombs were no longer sufficient. If the pharaoh was the pillar of the universe, his resting place must reflect that role. It must be more enduring than time, more solid than nature, and large enough to remind future generations that order once existed. The pyramids emerged from the fear of being forgotten. During the reign of Djoser, the first step pyramid was constructed. It was not perfect, but it carried a clear message. Humanity was learning to freeze time in stone. Each subsequent generation pushed further. The pyramids grew taller, larger, and more precise. And then, at Giza, the ultimate limits were challenged. The Great Pyramid of Khufu was not just a structure, it was the culmination of absolute belief. Tens of thousands worked not as nameless slaves, but as participants in a ritual that spanned decades. They believed that each stone placed correctly would help maintain Ma'at from collapsing. Inside the pyramid, everything was calculated for eternity. The corridors aligned with the stars. The burial chamber was sealed. Incantations were inscribed on the walls to protect the pharaoh's soul from the chaos of the afterlife. There was no room for error, for a small mistake could lead to the disintegration of order. In that moment, Egypt believed they had conquered time. But time was not defeated. It merely waited patiently. As the pyramids multiplied, the burden on society grew heavier. Resources dwindled. Power became overly concentrated. Local officials began to strengthen their hold. And when disasters struck, when the Nile no longer flooded on schedule, the forbidden question arose in people's minds. If the pharaoh was a god, why did the world fail? That question needed not be spoken. Merely thinking it, Ma'at began to fracture. The Old Kingdom did not collapse in a day. It disintegrated slowly, like a belief eroded. The pyramids still stood, immobile, perfect, but no longer guaranteed order. For the first time in history, the Egyptians faced a terrifying truth. The gods could remain silent. The desert winds blew through Giza. Sand began to cover the structures that once reached the sky, and Egypt entered its first darkness, not the darkness of destruction, but of doubt. Yet from that very darkness, another Egypt would be reborn. The darkness did not arrive like a storm, but like a prolonged sunset. After the Old Kingdom's disintegration, Egypt did not completely collapse, but it lost its direction. No longer was there an absolute center. No longer was there a single voice representing Ma'at. The pharaohs still existed, but their power now resembled an echo rather than a command. In distant provinces, the nomarchs' local governors ruled like petty kings. Laws were no longer unified. Rituals were no longer performed in synchrony. The cosmic order, once entrusted entirely to one individual, was now fragmented into many pieces. The Egyptians referred to this period as a time of turmoil, but deep down, it was a painful awakening. For the first time, they faced a question that had never existed before. If the pharaoh could no longer uphold Ma'at, then who would? The answer did not come immediately. It formed over generations, amidst famine, violence, and the fear that the world could collapse at any moment. But it was within this insecurity that a silent change occurred in the Egyptian consciousness. Order was no longer a divine privilege, but a human responsibility. When the Middle Kingdom emerged, Egypt did not return to its former self. It matured. The pharaohs of this period no longer built colossal pyramids to challenge time. Instead, they established laws, reformed administration, and expanded irrigation systems. Ma'at was no longer confined to rituals, but integrated into daily life. in justice, in the distribution of food, in the protection of the vulnerable. This ideology was clearly reflected in the literature of the Middle Kingdom texts, filled with skepticism, where humans questioned justice, solitude, and the silence of the gods. But Egypt did not stop there. Stability, once re-established, always carried ambition. As dynasties grew stronger, as granaries filled again, Egypt began to look beyond its borders. To the east lay the Sinai Peninsula with its copper and turquoise. To the south was Nubia with its gold and fierce warriors, and further still, lands that had never bowed to the pharaoh. It was then that Egypt entered the New Kingdom, a period where history was no longer written in stone and ritual, but in swords and blood. If the Old Kingdom was an era of absolute belief, the New Kingdom was an era of human will. Pharaohs like Ahmose, Thutmose, and Amenhotep were not merely keepers of order, but conquerors. They built a professional army, utilizing chariots, composite bows, and tactics learned from their enemies. Egypt no longer defended passively along the banks of the Nile. It advanced into the world, carrying the symbols of Ra and Ma'at, but also the very human ambition, domination. Thutmose III, whom posterity refers to as the Napoleon of Egypt, did not believe that order could sustain itself. He believed that Ma'at had to be imposed. Through dozens of military campaigns, Egypt expanded its influence as far as the Levant. The city-states were subdued. Tribute flowed into Thebes. Gold, slaves, and spoils of war poured like a second river parallel to the Nile. Temples rose everywhere. Karnak became a stone forest, where each column was a victory etched for eternity. But unlike the silent pyramids of the past, these structures told stories. They boasted. They declared that humanity, through the pharaoh, had mastered the world. Then, a crack appeared from an unexpected source: faith. Amenhotep IV, later known as Akhenaten, was not a warrior. He grew up amidst temples, rituals, and absolute power. But instead of reinforcing the old system, he saw its decay. The priests of Amun grew increasingly wealthy, their power rivaling that of the pharaoh. Ma'at, once an abstract principle, was now monopolized by a privileged class. Akhenaten resisted not with a sword, but with ideas. He proclaimed that there was only one god, Aten, the sun disk. No complex imagery, no tangled mythology, just light shining directly down to the world, sustaining all things. It was an unprecedented religious revolution, and far too early. Akhenaten moved the capital from Thebes, constructing a new city in the desert. Akhetaten, there, art transformed. The pharaoh was no longer depicted as an immovable deity, but as a human, slender, long-faced, playing with his children under the sun. For the first time, personal emotion entered royal art. But history is rarely forgiving to those ahead of their time. When Akhenaten died, his reforms quickly collapsed. The priests returned. His name was erased from stone. His city was abandoned. His son, Tutankhamun, renamed Tutankhamun, reverted to the old gods as a confession for the entire dynasty. The small tomb of Tutankhamun, preserved for thousands of years, is not just an archaeological treasure. It symbolizes the fragility of innovation in a civilization that revered order above all. After that upheaval, Egypt returned to its old path of power, but no longer with innocence. Ramses II emerged as the final affirmation of greatness. He built more than any pharaoh before him. He inscribed his name on every temple. He confronted the Hittite Empire at the Battle of Kadesh, a battle depicted on stone walls as a glorious victory, though in reality, it was a precarious stalemate. Ramesses understood the power of imagery. He recognized that in a vast empire, belief was as crucial as victory. Thus, history under his reign became a grand propaganda narrative. Yet behind the gold and magnificent reliefs, another truth was forming. The empire was too vast, the borders too long, The enemies too many. The economy was under heavy strain. Workers at Deir el-Medina, those who built tombs for the pharaoh, went on strike due to unpaid wages. For the first time in recorded history, collective laborers rose against the state. This was not merely a social event. It was a sign of fatigue. Egypt had come a long way from the early days of believing that order was divinely ordained. Now, order had to be maintained through force, money, and propaganda. Ma'at did not disappear, but it became burdensome, like a weight rather than a promise. And when a civilization begins to feel weary of its own greatness, history often prepares for an end. The desert winds blew again, no longer gentle as in the Old Kingdom. They carried sand, bearing the footsteps of those beyond the borders. Egypt still stood firm, but this time it stood firm by human will, no longer by absolute faith. And that was both a strength and a curse. No civilization dies in a thunderclap. Egypt did not collapse in a decisive battle, nor was it erased in a bloody day. Egypt died slowly, like an aging body aware that it had lived too long, bearing too many memories, and no longer had the strength to believe as before. After the time of Ramses II, the power of the pharaohs remained, but the belief in inviolability did not. The victories etched in stone now sounded more like reminders than declarations. The newly built temples bore the marks of repetition, no longer creativity. Egypt still stood there, but stood by habit, not by faith. Ma'at. The order that was once the soul of the universe did not vanish, but it was no longer a promise. It became a weary obligation, something to be maintained through hollow rituals, through military might, through taxes, through coercion. And when order must be enforced, it began to unravel. The northern border trembles. Groups of nameless sea people surge down like a tidal wave. To the west, the Libyans infiltrate. To the south, Nubia is no longer just a conquered land. Egypt, once the unshakable center of the known world, has now become an open battlefield. Pharaohs ascend to the throne in rapid succession. Their names are not etched into stone before being erased from memory. Temples lie in ruins. Priests vie for power. Rituals continue, but no one is certain that the gods are still listening. The Egyptians once believed that the world could endure indefinitely if the rituals were performed correctly. Yet now, the rituals remain intact, while the world collapses. This creates a terrifying void in consciousness. If order is no longer guaranteed by the divine, what significance do human efforts hold? That void paves the way for others to advance. The Assyrians arrive with pure violence. They do not need to become pharaohs, nor do they require the symbols of Ma'at. They conquer with iron and fear. For them, Egypt is not the center of the universe, but merely a territory to subdue. Temples are plundered, cities are set ablaze, pharaohs become vassals. For the first time, Egypt is ruled by those who do not believe in its gods. After the Assyrians come the Persians. The Persian kings are more cunning. They don the pharaoh's crown, respect the rituals, and offer tributes to the temples. But it is merely a facade. Order no longer arises from Egypt. It is permitted to exist by another empire. Egypt is no longer the subject of history. It becomes the backdrop. Then Alexander appears. He arrives swiftly like a storm, youthful and blazing, bringing with him the promise of a new world. The Egyptians welcome him as a pharaoh, not because he understands Ma'at, but because they need to believe that order can still be salvaged. Alexander travels to Siwa, proclaimed as the son of the god Amun, and in that fleeting moment, Egypt believes that history can begin anew. But Alexander dies young, and Egypt falls into the hands of Ptolemy, who transforms it into a Greek kingdom cloaked in Egyptian garb. Alexandria rises along the Mediterranean coast as a challenge to ancient Thebes. There, it is not the divine but knowledge that is revered. The Library of Alexandria is not built to serve eternity, but to gather the entirety of the world: mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, Everything is recorded, classified, and debated. Egypt becomes the center of Greek thought, no longer the center of the sacred universe. The ancient temples still stand. The rituals continue. But the soul of Egypt has shifted. Ma'at is no longer a living principle, but a legacy. And then, in the final chapter of ancient Egyptian history, Cleopatra emerges. She is not a pharaoh in the ancient sense. She is Greek, speaks Greek, and is educated in Greek philosophy. But she understands Egypt better than all her predecessors. Cleopatra speaks the Egyptian language. She participates in the rituals. She appears as a living Isis. Not out of superstition, but because she understands that power in Egypt lies not only in the military, but in collective memory. Cleopatra does not dream of eternal restoration. She dreams of survival. Amidst the rising Roman machine, Egypt has only one choice: to become a pawn or a partner. Cleopatra chooses the most dangerous game. She allies with Caesar, then with Antony. Not for the romantic love that later poetry recounts, but because it is the final move of a civilization too old to fight head-on. But Rome does not need partners. It needs grain. The Battle of Actium is not merely a military defeat. It is the moment Egypt loses the power to determine its own fate. When Antony dies, Cleopatra realizes there are no more moves left. She does not choose to be led in Octavian's triumphal procession. She chooses death, not as an escape, but as the final declaration of sovereignty. When Cleopatra dies, ancient Egypt dies with her. No more pharaohs, no more dynasties, no more power to define its own order. Egypt becomes a Roman province, the granary of the empire. The temples gradually close. Hieroglyphs are forgotten. The gods fall silent not because they have died, but because no one remains to call their names. Sand covers the stone. Centuries pass. Temples collapse. Pyramids are plundered. Mummies are unearthed. Yet something strange occurs. Egypt, though dead, does not vanish. It lives on in the questions it leaves behind. Why are humans obsessed with eternity? Why must order be trusted to exist? And what happens when a civilization understands death better than anyone else? Egypt does not triumph through power, it triumphs through memory, by compelling future generations to look back and question themselves. Today, the Nile still flows. The pyramids still stand. No more pharaohs, no more Ma'at as before. But whenever humans stand before stone, before desert, before time, they still hear the whispers of Egypt. We have survived. We have believed. And we have not vanished.